Welcome back to another edition of Gary's Record Collection. And today we're going to look at the Billboard Top 200 album chart from the 1960s to talk about one of the artists that absolutely dominated the charts in record sales, in top 10 albums. And, you know, we're not talking about the Beatles. No. We're not talking about the Rolling Stones. No. It's Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. Believe it or not, Herb Alpert was a gigantic artist in the 1960s in terms of record sales and chart domination. We've talked about one of the albums before, Whipped Cream and Utter Delights, a great album, and it went to #1. But the thing was, like when that became popular and the successor album, Going Places, they were just all over the place. They were on the radio, they were on TV. You couldn't get away from them, and everybody was buying that up. They loved that music. Let's go back to March 1966, the first week in March. Here's the top 3 albums on the Billboard charts. Take a look. Going Places, #1. Whipped Cream, #2. That's like, holy cow. The Beatles' Rubber Soul is #3. Sorry, Beatles, you've been displaced. They had been #1. But you look at Going Places, that is on the charts for 21 weeks. That had come out in September of 65. Whipped Cream, 43 weeks on the charts. That had come out the previous April. So that was on the charts for almost a year. And it's #2. That is quite amazing. And so you go then a month later, and in the top 10, 5 Herb Alpert records, and here they are. At #2, Whipped Cream and Utter Delights. #3, Going Places. #9, South of the Border. That came out in October of 64. And at #10 is the first album, The Lonely Bull, came out in December of 62. It did not chart until, 2.5 years later? That is crazy. But that was the power of those albums. And then we get to a point where the big 3 were Whipped Cream and Going Places, and then What Now My Love, which came out in May of 66. These 3 albums formed the bedrock of what Herb Alpert did on chart domination in the 60s. And of course, I have the spreadsheet with all the chart positions on it. Let's take a look, because this is outrageous. Outrageous. We're going to start up at the top. This is January of 65. So South of the Border finally charts after a couple of months, finally charts at 118. All right, okay, not too bad. Moves up 78, 67, 62. It peaks at 62. Okay, so, it's okay, but it might, kind of go down. And then here comes in May of 65, after it was released in April, it finally charts a month later, 113, 85. And it's starting to gain radio airplay. And it does move up the charts, and then becomes a top 10 album in 1965 in July. And everybody had that album. I mean, I have like 48 copies, and here's mine right now. It's like, this thing, everybody had this. It was outstanding. And so, okay, so he hit gold with that one. That's not bad. But then, of course, you get to August, and it starts to go back down on the charts, 22, 27, 29, 31. Well, kind of rebounds a little bit, 26, 25. But now, in September, here comes the whole thing with the popularity was Herb Alpert said, you know what? We need to get a band together and take this act out on the road. Up until that point, it was all studio musicians doing the music. And now the public was clamoring for more. They wanted to see these guys. So here come the TV appearances, here come in-concert appearances, and with that, more popularity. And oh, by the way, in September of 65, we're going to release Going Places too. And that debuts at 121, but in a short span of 6 weeks, it's top 10. And look what it did. It competes with Whipped Cream, which is #2 at the time. That is phenomenal for any artist to have top 2 albums in the top 10 at once on the Billboard charts. And then look at the back catalog, what starts to happen. South of the Border came back in at 144, started coming back up the charts. Later, at the end of November, The Lonely Bull came up, 132, started coming up the top of the charts. And by January, even Volume 2, which, I mean, I love Herb Alpert, but I guess that was probably the weakest album so far, according to sales and popularity. It had not charted at all. It finally charted in January of 66, 2 years after it had been released. Now you have, with the strength of Going Places and Whipped Cream, you've got 5 albums on the charts, and this wasn't even the top 200. At that time, Billboard was only doing, I believe, 140 albums, maybe 150. They did expand to 200 in a few years, but yeah, so it's 150 in January of 66. Then you start seeing the popularity grow. So Whipped Cream, Going Places, staying way in the top 10, number 1 in some cases. Here's April of 66, 2, 3, 9, and 10. Unbelievable performance. 4 out of those 5 albums that are in print are in the top 10. It's like Herb Alpert just came along with a bulldozer and said, everybody out of the way, I'm here. And if that wasn't enough, Going Places back on number 1. Oh, by the way, you know what? Let's put another album out. Here comes What Now My Love in May of 66. And started off at number 60, but the second week on the chart, jumped to number 2. And then was on the number 1 for 8 more weeks after that. Here's another example. May 21st, 1966. 2, 4, and 8. 3 albums in the top 10. And now 6 albums on the top 150 chart. And it was like that all the way through 1966. This means they are selling a lot of records. This is why when you go to the thrift store or the record store these days and you look in the dollar bins, you see like all these Herb Alpert records. It's like, did everybody have these? And the answer is yes, they did. Because here it is. All the proof is in the pudding right there. And that continued all the way through 1966. What Now My Love stayed in the top 10 until December. So it went from May to December in the top 10. Unbelievable. Just in time for another album to be put out. Here comes SRO in November of 66. 3 weeks, it got up to number 3 on the chart. And still, you have Going Places at number 7, and then What Now My Love at 10, with Whipped Cream, a respectable 20 behind it. But then all the albums are still on the chart at that point. It went like that until February of 67. February 4th was the last time that now 7 albums were on the top 150 chart for Billboard. Volume 2 finally dropped off. It had been languishing around the bottom, and it finally dropped. But that's still very impressive. And The Lonely Bull, which was from December of 62, still on the chart. So now you're looking at, 3 years later, 4 years, it's like these are big numbers. And then it just keeps going on, and they stay on the charts. And here comes Sounds Like Herb Alpert, and that comes out in May of 67. 101 the first week, up to number 4 on week 2, number 1 album on the 3rd week. It did not stay at number 1. It only was there for that 1 week, but it stayed in the top 10 for several weeks afterwards. And again, all of these albums were on the top chart along with that. But what you'll now start to notice is when we get into 1967, it's like, yeah, they're all on the chart, but they're not quite as high as they had been previously. So maybe the power of Sounds Like Herb Alpert in July of 1967. And remember what time it is in the music. This is like the summer of love. Monterey Pop Festival. There's a big change coming in music, and the pop sounds of Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass they're not long for the tooth, because the industry has changed, the music has changed, what people are listening to has changed. And you can start to see it in the power is not there in the sustainability of all those albums in the back catalog. Still, I mean, Going Places and Whipped Cream in the top 20s, 20 to 30 for a good part of that year. And you're talking 2 years out after they've been released. So Sounds Like dropped out of the top 10 by September of 67, and they're still on the charts. it's not bad. And then finally in December of '67, here comes Herb Alpert's Ninth, with the Beethoven cover on the front. Beethoven wearing the Herb Alpert shirt, which was kind of funny. Again, starts off low, jumps to 19 at week 2. It gets into the top 10, and now we're into January, February, March of 1968, and it gets into the top 10. It's in there for 8, 9, 10, 11 weeks, but you look at the other albums, and they're not as high as they had been. Going Places is down to 50. Whipped Cream, 34, okay, down to 44. What Now My Love, 53, 49. So they're close. They're still around. It goes on. Even the Beat of the Brass, which came out in May of '68, it does the same thing. Starts really low, 83. It's like a partial reporting week, it seems, and then jumps right to number 7. And that was pushed because of the Beat of the Brass TV special where Herb Alpert sang This Guy's in Love with You. And that was a number 1 single, and it was on that album. So that album sold really well because of that single. They rushed to get that album out and to include that single because it was so popular. But at this point, in now end of May 1968, Beat of the Brass is number 7. But look at the supporting albums. Sounds Like Herb Alpert, down to 182, and that's only the 2 albums previous. SRO, 192. What Now My Love, 91. Going Places, 79. Whipped Cream, 98. The others, 151, 178. So they are down, and you can see by June of 1968, Goodbye Lonely Bull, Goodbye South of the Border, Sounds Like has also dropped out. So that is signaling the end of that era where anything that Herb Alpert put out, it went to the top of the charts, and all the back catalog was right along there with it. Beat of the Brass, it was a top 10 album for the whole summer. Even got to number 1 in August. But then you look and you just see that the supporting albums are not there, except the triple threat, Whipped Cream, Going Places, and What Now My Love are still hanging around. And they hung around for a long time, even when the other albums were dropping out. Beat of the Brass started dropping into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and you can see even Whipped Cream dropped off the chart in October of 1968, which is 3.5 years after it had been released. That's like 180 weeks. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good performance for an album. Going Places had dropped off a few weeks previously. Again, the number of weeks that these records were on the charts isn't crazy. Whipped Cream and Under the Lights, 185 weeks. Going Places, 164 weeks. South of the Border, 163 weeks. The Lonely Bull, 133 weeks. What Now My Love, 129 weeks. There's 5 albums that are over 100 weeks on the top 200 chart. And the next one's SRO was on for 85 weeks, and even Volume 2 was 56 weeks. But the performance is crazy. And then you start to see we're into the end of 1968 going into 1969, and now the back catalog is dropping off, where we only have the actual the single album that's out at the time, Beat of the Brass, and now it's dropping to 105, and it'll eventually go down to 175 and drop off the chart in May of '69. And then there's several weeks, 5 weeks before another Herb Alpert album charts, and that's Warm, which came out in June of '69, and it did not bring any of the back catalog with it. So, and you can see that it peaked at 28. It didn't even make it to the top 20. But it stayed on the chart for most of the year, all the way to the end of December of '69. And The Brass Are Coming, which was also released in December of '69. It overlapped for 6 weeks. But again, not a top 20 album. Got up to number 30. Okay, that's not bad. I guess if you had one album out and you got to number 30, that'd pretty good to hang a hat on. But also by that time, Herb Alpert was pretty much done. After Beat of the Brass Are Coming, he was like, I'm tired of this. He could feel the industry was changing. He didn't want to just keep doing the same repetitive thing over and over. And the band went on hiatus. He just basically called it quits without really coming out and say the Tijuana Brass are finished. They just kind of stopped doing stuff. And A&M still, they have to sell records. So what do? They put out a greatest hits album in 1970. And that was on the chart for 32 weeks, but it didn't really perform all that well. It got to 43. But here's the other thing. It's like everybody had all these albums. So it's like, why do you need a greatest hits album if everybody has all these albums? Maybe for the 8-tracks in the car at the time, I guess. And then we go into, after greatest hits, there was another album called Summertime, and then the Solid Brass and Four-Sider, and then you get into the 70s, and there was also another album, Bullish, in the 80s that came out. But none of them brought the back catalog with them, which the power there was just amazing. So the big three: Whipped Cream, Going Places, What Now My Love. You'll find them in the thrift stores or the record stores, and you know what? Go ahead and pick them up. Pick up the stereo versions because they sound great. They are extremely popular. They sold millions of copies. They outsold the Beatles, people. They outsold the Beatles. That's pretty good in my book. So hope you like the spreadsheet dive into the Billboard Top 200 of the 1960s. Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. 3 albums making a huge impact. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time on Gary's Record Collection.